Check, check. 1, 2. Testing. Hindi kapag dito ko, okay lang. Ikaw may speaker, okay. Kahit kuhan mo lang. Sa bagay kag hinaan lang. Okay, yun. Check. Oh, wala ka.
Magandang hapon sa inyo. Welcome to our special lecture this afternoon on negotiating gender within multicultural families in non-highly urbanized areas of South Korea, organized by the Department of Anthropology, cooperation with the Korean Studies Program, of course, in Asia, under the School of Social Sciences at Ateneo de Manila University. So we are very lucky to have with us here a very special lecture to deliver, to share, the study. Okay, and before we begin, we would like to welcome, of course, to deliver opening remarks and welcome all of us this afternoon. Let us welcome with a round warm of applause the Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Dr. Jeolla Province.
Thank you, Oliver. I may not deliver an opening remarks. I thought that I would introduce a little bit um, uh, our guest speaker, who is not only a friend of the department, but actually part of the Department of Sociology. We would still consider her as a faculty of the department because she's been teaching from time to time whenever the department calls on her. Our speaker, Johanna Zulueta, holds a professorship at the Department of Global Diversity Studies at the Faculty of Sociology of Toyo University. And that marks it. Johanna has been, or Hannah as we call her, is a sociologist and had a long list of sociological engagement. And she was an alumni she is an alumni of the Ateneo with the department. She's been into several other areas of research, but particularly on migrations in East Asia, particularly examining and investigating on issues concerning ethnicity, military base or basing, gender and families, citizenship, and aging. That's the stretch of her research engagement. She's very well published internationally and had recently published a book that she gifted to us, Women and COVID-19, a clinical and applied sociological focus on family, work, and community. She edited this book with Miriam Sidat Khan, a collection of women's situation during the recent pandemic. As I said earlier, Hannah has been engaged in sociological work and networking. With that, she is currently serving as a steering committee member of the Philippine Migration Research Network while serving concurrently as the executive board or as part of the executive board of the research committee on clinical psychology of the International Sociological Associations. She has several appointments at various universities in Asia, um, including the Seoul National University Asia Center, but of course our very own department, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ateneo. But without further ado, I'll give the floor with the indulgence of the host to Professor Hannah Zulueta.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joel Kanuday, for that generous introduction. So this is my research. Okay, so the title of my research is Negotiating Gender Within Multicultural Families in Non-Highly Urbanized Areas of South Korea. So I'd like to acknowledge the funding that I Foundation, the Korea Foundation grant for field research in 2023, so just last year. So I am pretty much new to research on South Korea because for the past 2 decades, I've been doing research on Japan. So just to give you a background of my research trajectory, So I've been doing research on Okinawa, particularly on military basing and migration. So since I was a graduate student, so I looked at labor migration within the context of the military bases in Okinawa, which is in Japan, right? And then I also looked at Filipino-based workers and then their wives who are Japanese or basically from Okinawa. Then I also analyzed the Okinawan women's stories. So about their migration to the Philippines. So I'm reading everything here. And then, so because of that, I wrote and published and also published 2 books based on that research. So Transnational Identities on Okinawa's Military Bases and Okinawan Women's Stories of Migration. I think the first book is in the JSP Department, Japanese Studies program. And then recently, I decided to look at older Filipino women in Japan. Being a Filipino scholar based in Japan, I realized that I have to know more about my own country, right? My fellow Filipinos. And I also tried to understand their aging process. So I looked at aging Filipino women or older Filipino women. And then in 2018, I also did study in Malaysia, funded by the Japan Foundation. And then 2020 to present, I also focused on Filipino marriage migrants in non-highly urbanized areas or rural areas in Japan, which have been researched before, but then I am looking now at their aging and social well-being. And then in 2023, because I planned on doing comparative study with South Korea, I decided to do this research on South Korea. So for this presentation, I will be focusing on this study and my the fieldwork that I did last year in South Korea for almost 2 months. So what is this study about? So in 2015, it is said that Southeast Asian migrants account for around 35% of marriage migrants in South Korea, most of them coming from Asia, particularly Vietnam. Now you have a lot of Vietnamese in South Korea. Vietnamese marriage migrants as well as labor migrants through the EPS system of South Korea. And of course, you also have Filipinos, right? And then so you also have a large number of Filipinos, but recently you also have more Vietnamese. So this presentation is part of a larger study on rural multicultural families in South Korea, focusing on those with Filipino marriage migrants. So we have to note that Filipino women entered South Korea as foreign brides starting in the 1990s. So the reason why I started looking at South Korea is the fact that because I do migration in Japan, looking at Japan as a country of migration, as a so-called mono-ethnic country, it's very much similar, right, with South Korea. And the trajectory of South Korea is very much similar with what has happened in Japan. So I decided to also look into South Korea this time. So this study primarily focuses on non-highly urbanized areas or so-called rural areas. I use the term non-highly urbanized areas because, of course, when we say rural, we have this connotation that it is very much backward, or rural meaning very much agricultural. But then people kept on asking me, how do you define rural, right? Especially when I was presenting my research on Japan, when I talked about rural, if I translate it into Japanese, they kept on my Japanese colleagues kept on asking me, how do you define rural? So because a lot of areas have been changing, so they're not really very much agricultural or really rural, so it's more mixed. So I decided to use this term non-highly urbanized areas because some of the areas that I visited, it's pretty much mixed. It's mainly agricultural. It's not yet a city, but then you have the KTX or the high-speed train passing through that place, for example. It has a stop in that place, so making it probably a non-highly urbanized area. So yeah, and I also quoted here Kim and Fire that rural areas are also being transformed by the presence of migrants, particularly marriage migrants. So it's not only in Japan, but it's also in South Korea. So I also look at how these women, especially for this particular presentation of mine, right now negotiate gender norms and expectation within these multicultural families, or in Korean, Ramonwa Kajok. Okay? It's different with the case of Japan because multiculturalism is pretty much big in these two countries, Japan and South Korea. But in the case of Japan, they don't use the term multicultural family. They use the term multicultural coexistence. They don't use multiculturalism because if you 1999. And she spoke of several cultural adjustments, including food. Many of them said that they had difficulty eating kimchi before, right? So because everything had kimchi, so it was difficult for them. And of course, the smell, right? If you're not used to the kimchi, right? The smell. And this was in the 90s, right? Or early 2000s, right? And the language and then cultural traditions, which is very much different, especially in the rural areas. And then also the relationship with her in-laws. Okay. But now she's pretty much settled, and she owns several real estate in that town. Nancy, she met her husband in the Philippines when she was teaching him English in Manila. Okay. And then she said that she never expected to be in a relationship with a Korean, but this student of hers, so her former student, went back to the Philippines to look for her. So again, challenges upon arriving in Korea, again, food, interpersonal relationships. So they kept on telling me about the food. But now many of them are pretty much well adjusted to the food. Okay. Grace, so she has been living in South Korea for 16 years. So in this case, she was introduced to her Korean husband by her Filipino friend who also married a Korean. So that's how they met their husbands. So it's also the same in the case of Japan. Networks, so friendship networks or family networks, right? Some of these women get to know their husbands through these networks. So in the case of Grace, she has a university education, but she actually told me that she also considered marriage to a Korean as an opportunity for upward mobility, right? Hypergamy. She used to work as an English teacher, but now she works at a company. Again, the term company, she told me, Huesa, which is basically factory. Okay, Alice, in her case, she was a foreign trainee at a Korean company. So she was sent by the company to work as a trainee. I think, if I remember correctly, she was a chemist. And then she met her husband at the factory where she was working at, and her future husband was her supervisor at that time. Okay, so again, when she settled in South Korea, she had to adjust to a lot of things, especially kimchi, right? Food, language, and toilets, relationship with in-laws. Oh, because she moved to a rural area. So toilet meaning during this time, because the toilet was outside the house, right? So especially if it's cold, right? You have to go outside of the house. Okay. Moving on. So I titled this Gender, Family, and Religion. The significance of gender, family, and religious ideals play in marriage migration should not be overlooked. So I emphasize the role of the Unification Church because it has this ideal of promoting happy families because they actually matchmake, right? And you have those mass marriages happening. In fact, I don't know if the UC is very much active here. I don't think so. But I heard that there's still a headquarters here of the UC. But it's pretty much, I think it's not really obvious to a lot of people. And then again, the ideal of family and Catholic background of these Filipino marriage migrants. So expectation versus reality, right? Because they see that their expectations were not really met, especially with regards to relationships with the in-laws, okay, and then other cultural traditions. Okay, I quote here Hyun-mi Kim when she argued that marriage migrants are performers of Koreanness, because again, as I've mentioned earlier, you have to assimilate into Korean culture, you have to assimilate into the family. And so you have to know not only the language, but also the customs, the different customs. And especially in rural areas, they're very much strict. So for example, if you have Chuseok, mid-autumn, or you have the Solal, the Lunar New Year, so you have to, it's a marriage migrant's task, right, to perform these traditions as well. So it's also pretty much gendered because it's the wife's role. And now, because the wife is a foreigner, so also the marriage migrants have to perform these traditions. So they have to be informed about cultural and societal norms and trained to be Korean wives. So it's not only language, You also have training on Korean culture and society before and after arriving in South Korea. So there are videos even training these marriage migrants, not only Filipinos, but also even Vietnamese, to become better Korean wives, or to become like Korean wives. So they also had to be domesticated within the Korean patriarchal family, and thus this is some sort of like maternal citizenship, right? Thus the access to social rights and citizenship. That is why, because they're seen as, reproducing the next generation of South Koreans. So there was easy access for them to citizenship and social rights compared to other labor migrants, for example. Okay. So again, the importance of the family in South Korean society or in Korean society. For negotiating gender within the family, these women, including some of my informants, had to negotiate gendered expectation and norms within the family. They told me that because they wanted to maintain family harmony and keep the marriage intact. They didn't want a divided family. They didn't want to be divorced. So what did they do? They performed, I wrote here, performance of subservience and submissiveness to the husband and in-laws to avoid conflict and to have a successful marriage. So even if, somehow the expectation in a Filipino marriage, right, somehow it's mostly equal, right? But then in a South Korean marriage, especially if it's more traditional, the women, it's really very much highly patriarchal, right? But then according to my informants, they had to be subservient if they want the marriage to be maintained, to be intact. So many of my informants experienced culture shock because of the gender norms, right? In the Korean Filipino marriage, as their expectations on marriage were shaped by a more egalitarian setup, so to speak, as characteristic of most Filipino marriages. So it's more like partnership, right? Of course, it's still patriarchal, but not as patriarchal as, or even hierarchical as South Korea's family, right? Because of Confucianism, Confucian culture. Okay. This is also the reason why recently there's a lot of Vietnamese marriage migrants because of the preference of Korean men for Vietnamese women because of Confucian norms. So it's mostly similar. And then the skin color. So many Vietnamese have lighter skin than Filipinos, they say. Okay. And then there are, however, Filipino wives who do not compromise on expected gender norms in the family and demand that their husbands share in the housework. So according to Alice, this is a pseudonym, she shared that when she asked her husband to help her with housework, her in-laws used to get mad at her when the couple moved houses, it was much easier for Alice and her husband to have an equal relationship. Okay. So again, the significance of the in-laws. And then these Filipino wives also work to earn for their natal family, meaning the family back home. Their natal family's upkeep and their Korean children's education, including hagwon fees. So hagwon is like the after school, like academies. So sometimes because Korea is a very much competitive society, so they also have to compete. So you have the formal schooling, and then after that, they go to, let's say, piano class or math class or English class. Okay. And then I note here filial obligation as a daughter in the case of their Filipino families. At the same time, they also have to perform their role as a wife and mother. Okay. There are some who, despite knowing that they will be in conflict with their in-laws and husbands, demand that they be treated equally and with respect. So for example, Lisa shared how she always reminded her husband that she was a police officer back in the Philippines and that she could always report any abuse to the authorities. So it has become a capital, cultural capital for her. And then Lisa uses her cultural capital, right, and social capital as a way to navigate relationships with her husband, her former husband, and her in-laws. So she used to say that, I was a police officer. Okay. So in a way, and then I guess the in-laws were afraid. And then Melissa shared how she used to deal with all of her husband's family members when they were living with the family. She said that she would fight back whenever her in-laws demanded her to do something unreasonable or burdensome, like too much housework, especially during, these festivities, events like the Mid-Autumn Chuseok, right? Because they have to do all of the things. They have to do all of the cooking, and then the Korean ancestor worship, like the Chesa. They also have to do that. It's because of again, it's gendered, so it's the duty of the wife, and they happen to be the wives of, let's say, the oldest son, for example. Okay, so for Melissa, fighting back was the way for her to emphasize her role as a wife, a family member, and a citizen tasked with reproducing the next generation of Koreans, and not as an unpaid worker. Okay. So yeah, while being aware of their roles as wives, raising Korean children, these women have managed to use their roles as mothers to impart their own culture to their children as well. So language learning, for example, food ways, occasional trip to the Philippines, which I also saw among my informants in Japan. But then many of them also have children who have completely assimilated into Korean culture, so their identities are very much more Korean. So some of the women also ask their parents to come to Korea to help them in raising their children. So this is pretty much easy for the parents of the spouses, the Filipino wives, because of the visa. So it's easy for the the Filipino parents to stay in Korea for a few months. Okay, and then this is still pretty much in progress. So reimagining womanhood, do these Filipino wives reimagine or perform a kind of womanhood away from traditional family roles? Do they challenge and or subvert existing models as to how marriage migrants are expected to perform? So I looked at cultural capital, the economic role of migrant wives, because many of them are dual earner families. They have to work as well, especially for their children's education. And then the utilization of Sunday worship or mass services and a Catholic church as a space for socialization, which I see as moving out of their duties as wives and mothers, even for just one day. This is also pretty much the same in the case of Japan. And yeah, so to conclude, I found that some of these women have navigated gendered cultural expectations in the Korean household, thus reproducing gender norms within the traditional Korean family and playing a significant role in keeping the family intact. However, I also saw instances of subverting gendered expectations that led to conflict within these families. Some women have managed to utilize their role as mothers to introduce their own culture. And in a way, these women are able to reimagine a different kind of womanhood away from traditional family norms, meaning traditional Korean family norms, thus challenging existing models of how marriage migrants are expected to perform. So this concludes my presentation. It's still pretty much preliminary. I'm just starting to analyze things. I'm just showing you photos of from my fieldwork. So Gongju Migrant Catholic Community celebrated its first anniversary last year. So it was good timing that I was there. So this is the Hongsong Hanfil community. Hanfil meaning Korean Filipino. Okay, so Han from the Korean word Hanguk, okay, meaning Korea. And then I visited a marriage migrant's house. So this is in Hongsong, but it's away from the city center. Well, it's not really a city, it's a gun, it's like a county. And it's pretty much a farm. And then I also attended a multicultural workshop hosted by the Philippine Embassy. In fact, it was the first time that the Philippine Embassy hosted this. And I asked, why only now? I mean, you've been having a lot of marriage migrants since the late 1990s, but then they only started doing this now, just last year. Okay, so introducing aspects of Philippine culture to Korean Filipino children. Okay, and then the language. And then I was invited by some of my informants in Hongsong to attend this Asia Music Festival, which is again some sort of like a multicultural festival, right? So showcasing culture. So some of these photos, yeah, this is the Philippine tent. one was by the marriage migrants and the others were from those labor migrants of EPS. And then this is, yeah, you have Vietnamese, and then these are, it's not clear, but this is a Visayan dance performed by some marriage migrants. And then, yeah, so a Korean in Hamburg, just, she was introducing the, the performers. So for, if you, I don't know if you read Korean, it says it there in English, we are one in music, but then in Korean, it says also we are one in music and food. Okay, and then it's the 9th Asian Music Festival. Okay, so yeah, I was also told that Hong Song-gun is pretty much as aggressive. So my host professor, so my colleague actually told me, next time when you come to Korea, or yeah, he told me, when you come to Korea, focus on Hong Song because it's a pretty much dynamic community. So hopefully I can return to Korea this year for field work, and then I can do more study on this particular community. Oh, okay. So these are the churches that I visited, and then I also interviewed some of the interviewees here. What is interesting, if you've been to South Korea, South Korea is known for its quaint cafes. So I noticed that even in churches, there are also very cute cafes. So I also took a photo of this. This is a cafe in Cheonan Catholic Church. Okay. So, and then this, this is, Cheonan Catholic Church and Gongju Catholic Church. I also did interviews on September 9, 2023. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll really appreciate it. Thank you. Again, this is very much preliminary, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zulueta. Let's give her a round of applause. Maraming salamat muli. We now open the floor for those who might have questions. Also for those who are joining us online, feel free to write your comments and suggest comments and questions on the chat box. Okay, anyone from our audience? Yes, Dr. Nino.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you for a comprehensive presentation. It's really, really insightful. No? My first question has something to do with the notion of multiculturalism. And you did mention quite intriguingly that it is a controversial concept, much less a controversial narrative in South Korea. I was wondering if there are competing, in light of this attempt to promote multiculturalism, I was wondering if that has an impact on the notion of Koreanness that is promoted by the state. So much so that now we see competing notions of Koreanness. Is that something that is imaginable or that is even happening in Korea given the context? Or does the state manage to succeed in consistently and coherently promoting its brand of Koreanness? Thank you.
Okay, should I collect questions or should I answer the question?
Maybe we can begin with one question and then we'll collect after.
Yeah, thank you for that thought-provoking question. So yeah, I'm still pretty much new to studies of Korean, of Korea. But yeah, based on my studies, based on what I've read so far, I guess because I mentioned this multiculturalism, right? Multicultural families, and how early on it was easy for the marriage migrants to somehow acquire citizenship. Thus, that Koreanness somehow it's not anymore that static Koreanness, because you have marriage migrants, right? They're Koreans, but actually they come from, let's say, the Philippines, Vietnam, etc. So yeah. And then you also have the so-called people of mixed ancestry, right? The children of the marriage migrants, which basically it's the new generation of Koreans, right? And now I remember they also allowed these children to be in the military. Okay, maybe Murphy can also help me here. And then, so yeah, although this is pretty much still debatable, because I haven't really looked into the Amerasian problem. Meaning Amerasians, these are offspring of Korean women married to American servicemen working on base. But again, that's a different issue because, again, of the stigma accorded or stigma of towards Korean women who married these American soldiers because of, they met them around the base, probably they were prostitutes, etc. So it's a different issue compared to these marriage migrants. So yeah, but then, as I also mentioned, from 2010, it's now difficult even for these marriage migrants to acquire citizenship. And I also heard from my colleagues that the country, the government now is becoming more conservative. So hence, that would be interesting to look at, right, in terms of Koreanness. But yeah, again, because I see it as assimilationist. So whenever I look at Korea, I also compare with Japan, that even though you have all these, let's say, half Korean children in military or let's say in showbiz like the Japanese, it's still more like, they're still expected to assimilate. And then there's that pressure to be Korean, right? So again, are they really accepted? So yeah, that's also my question. I don't know if I answered your question in terms of South Korea, but in the case of Japan, it's still pretty much the same, right? When let's say multiculturalism and Japaneseness. There was even a controversy recently because one Miss Japan winner, she's Japanese legally, but she's actually from Ukraine. So ethnically Ukrainian. Now, she's not even half Japanese. But then people were saying, is this a Japanese? She's not even half. So again, that's that led to a debate on Japaneseness. So I'm thinking maybe Korea is also the same. Yeah, but in terms of, so I'll stop there. So again, thank you very much for your comments. But maybe for Korean culture, maybe it's more open, right? I don't know. In terms of K-pop, or because you have all these K-pop groups wherein you have multicultural members, right? Members from the Philippines, Japan, US. But again, it's a different issue. So yeah, thank you. I don't know if I answered your question, but thank you for that question. I will note that down.
Thank you very much. Others might have questions. Feel free to approach the mic. Actually, I have a question, but yes, you can go first, and then I'll the mic, please, so our online participants can hear it as well.
So, thank you very much. It was very informative, and I have two questions. Maybe I didn't catch up or I didn't understand it, but who is responsible for this culture trainings? And is it official training, or we just call it culture training, like you can pass the test with the culture or not? This is my first question. And the second one, do the Filipino women compare Filipino men to Koreans?
Okay.
And what they are saying about this?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for those questions. So cultural training, in a way, it's expected. So you have, let's say, Philippine government, the CFO. They give out trainings, but they're also supported by the Korean government. So in fact, when I visited the CFO, you have pamphlets from the Korean government translated into different languages. But in the case of CFO, it was in English. So how to adapt to Korean norms, Korean culture, what is expected of you, right? I even encountered a video before talking about how you should be like a Korean wife, right? How to act if you are in front of your mother-in-law, right? These kinds of things. And apparently it also happens in other countries like Vietnam. So again, it's really top-down compared to Japan. Japan never had, to my knowledge, they didn't have these kinds of trainings. So in the case of South Korea, it's really very much top-down government down, because Korea is very much assertive in this case. So that's why I mentioned earlier, they really support marriage migrants. But how about the other migrants, right? Labor migrants, for example. So yeah, cultural training. Comparing Filipino men and Korean men. Yeah, some came out from my interviews. So some said that, yeah, Korean men, they know that Korean men, because of the stereotypes, right, that they are abusive, right, they're very much patriarchal, but then they will tell me, but my husband is different. Okay. Yeah, it's stereotype, but my husband is different. And then some of those who I interviewed, who had husbands who were alcoholics, who experienced abuse, they say that it wasn't expected. Especially those who met their husbands through the Unification Church. Then they said, oh, I didn't expect that my husband will be a farmer, or that my husband is abusive as an alcoholic. So it's difficult, right? And then some of them, they also had experience with former Filipino partners who were not, not good men, in a way, alcoholics as well. Right? But they also said, some of them said that it's different in terms of, maybe in terms of expressing care or love. So that's the difference. I don't know if you know the term lambing. Lambing is how is lambing in English? What is lambing in? Affection, showing affection, right? So they mentioned that Filipinos are more maybe showy with their affection, but then Koreans maybe not. So yeah, so there are comparisons. Yeah. Thank
you
you.
very much. Yeah, we have one question, and then I can ask my question also. Sige. Yeah.
Hello, I just wanted to say that I really loved your talk. It was very enlightening. My question is related to, what was it? In relation to the, I guess, in this case, perhaps preference for the marriage partners, particularly the wives, to be coming from Southeast Asia. Is there like perhaps an underlying assumption that these women would be more subversive or more catering to the traditional roles expected of wives, as opposed to people from other regions in the world? That's it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, there is an expectation that women from Southeast Asia, right, are more docile, right? Maybe they're more subservient because of economic standing as well, right? Most of these women are from developing countries, right? So yeah, you have some from Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, then parts of China. In the case of China, they're mostly ethnic Korean, so Korean Chinese. But yeah, so that's the expectation, right? But then, according to my Filipino informants, they also say that, yeah, they perform subservience, but some of them, they assert their own Filipino-ness. Some of them said, well, Filipino ako, I have to, Filipino tayo, we have to fight, right? I guess that's also one reason why there's a preference now for the Vietnamese, because of the Confucian tradition, right? And if you are familiar with Confucianism, it's very much patriarchal, it's very much hierarchical. And yeah, and Korea is still very much a Confucian country. The Philippines is not, right? So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. I just have one question, Doc Johanna. Because with the rise of social media, we've also seen some of these migrants vlogging. I'm not sure if you've come across some of them. And they use the online platform. They actually have YouTube channels, and they actually give us a glimpse of their everyday lives. And you can see there how they negotiate between being Korean and being Filipino, how they try to specifically, for example, tell their kids how to do one thing in the Filipino way, how to eat like a Filipino, but at the same time they're eating Korean food. So what do you think is the effect, or how is this space being used by our migrants, or for those who have married into Korean families, as an opportunity perhaps for their voices to be heard, but at the same time to also try to remind their husbands, for example, that these kids should also be raised as Filipinos?
Yes, yeah, I think that's an important question. In fact, well, when I presented this in Korea, of course, they're not aware of this social media, right? Yeah, and I think I really have to check out these videos. Someone also told me about this, right? So yeah, because I'm not a social media person that much. But anyway, yes, it's really important, especially with regards to negotiating between, identities between Korean and Filipino. And then you ask, how is this use of social media as a space, right? For identity negotiations, and if they can influence the husbands, right? So my question is, again, I will also ask a question. Who are the audience, right, of the SOCMED? YouTube videos, TikTok, are these geared towards Filipinos? Do the husbands know that their spouses have these TikTok videos or YouTube? And how is it, because I haven't really seen this, but I have to check, right? Is it in Tagalog?
It's in
Mix in even in Korean?
Filipino, English, Tagalog.
Ah.
Filipino, English, Korean.
Korean. So yeah. So again, we have to also look at the audience engagement if Koreans also watch, right? So that's my question. So yes, probably it will be a good space, especially if their husbands are aware, right? But again, yeah, these are just assumptions. It can also be a subversive space that probably because they do not have a means to showcase their culture or to maybe be more vocal about this identity negotiations. They use social media as that space, right, to reach out. So yeah, that would be a good thing to explore. Thank you for that question. So yeah.
And probably in a bigger scale for policy making as well.
Yes, for policy making.
As the
So
level of
yeah.
government.
Yeah. Yes, I think policymakers should. I think even in Japan they also have these videos, but then I'm not. Yun nga, kasi I think I need to watch YouTube videos and TikTok. So yeah.
Thank you
So yeah,
much.
thank you for that question. Yeah.
You have time for one more question? Anyone else? Ayan.
Thank you for that talk, Dr. Zulueta. Actually, I do have two questions. Although we have room, as Sir Oliver said, for one more.
One more person.
Okay, one more person. That's better. First is about the side of the Philippines, no, in terms of policy. Is there a degree? Do we openly or in any degree endorse marriage migrants? So, or are the trainings happening after the fact, meaning after they are there? Second is about actually this gap, after the end of a marriage. So a Filipina there may or may not be a citizen, may or may not have a child with a Korean. So what happens within that gap of you're not married to a Korean anymore, and you will be married soon to one informant married to a Pakistani, or maybe marrying another Korean. So what happens within that void of you're not married to someone, you're not a citizen, you may or may not have a child with a Korean.
Okay. Okay, thank you for those questions. In terms of policy, does the Philippine government endorse marriage migrants? Of course, they will say no. But then I remember asking CFO, one of the bosses there. She said that, of course, you have CFO, which is different from DMW, Department of Migrant Workers, right? Because they handle the immigrants and then marriage migrants. So what they're doing is that she said we can't blame them because many of them will say they marry for love. So again, the role of emotions, right? And then they actually screen out people, right? because before you leave the Philippines, you will be screened, right? Are you really, is this really love, or is this really marriage of convenience or economic, etc., etc.? And because you sometimes you have partners with large gaps, age gaps, right? Let's say a 20-year-old girl marrying like a 50-year-old, 60-year-old American man. And then it's basically, and then they find out that it's illegal. So I don't think as a policy they do not endorse, but because, right, because you have a lot of um, marriage trajectories, right? You have the UC, right? So if the Unification Church, if they get married through the Unification Church, of course, usually marriage to migrants is very much gendered. So it's the woman who moves, right? So if they meet, let's say their spouse online, of course, you have the marriage migrant woman who moves. So, and yeah, so I don't think as a policy, they do not endorse marriage migrants, but because you have a lot of people migrating for marriage, then it's happening. That's why you have the CFO. So yeah, and then I hope I answered your question. So the void of not being married, again, it depends on the visa status. So for example, I think one of my cases, she was married to a Korean, then she got divorced, and then she married a Pakistani. In her case, she's already a citizen, so there's no problem, right? But if you have a spouse visa, I think in South Korea, it's also the same as Japan. So in the case of Japan, for instance, if you only have a spouse visa, if you get divorced, then your visa status is also, it is dependent on your marital status, right? So you are in danger of not having a visa unless you're able to acquire a work visa, right? Or let's say if you have a child, then you have a dependent. If the child is a Japanese national or Korean national, then you will be the dependent of that child, right? But then if you're childless, you're not a citizen, right? You're not married, so you are in a vulnerable position unless you have a visa status, whether it's a student or a work visa. So again, it all depends on the visa status. And it changes. I think it very much changes. So if you're interested in issues about, citizenship, visa, it's very much changeable. As I've said, I also heard that South Korea changed a lot with regards to its visa policies, even Japan also recently. So I hope I answered your question. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zulueta. So that's all the time that we have. Once again, let us thank our speaker for this evening, Dr. Johanna Zulueta from Toyo
Thank you very much.
University. Maraming salamat po, ma'am. Kamsahamnida.
Kamsahamnida.
So thank you again to all those who came this afternoon, and maraming salamat, and see you sa next lecture. Good evening. Maybe ask yung mga sumama sa atin, we have a short photo opportunity with our speaker. Let's have a photo taken.